I'm Amin Saikal, Professor and Director of the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies at the Australian National University. Today we are extremely pleased to have Major General John Cantwell with us, who has just published a book which is called Exit Wounds. And I'm delighted that he's given us time to have an interview with him. Major General, first of all, I have read excerpts of your book and found it to be very moving.
Thank you.
Why did you write this book, and what do you hope to achieve by it?
I wrote it because I found myself in a very difficult situation last year after I returned from being the commander of our forces in Afghanistan and the wider Middle East. I had been struggling with the emotional consequences of my experiences in 3 different wars: Iraq in 1991, Iraq again in 2006, and then those experiences as the commander in Afghanistan. And I was suffering from what is described as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And I've struggled with this for the last 20 years, and for almost all of that time I've kept it a secret and suppressed it and not told anybody, and very much kept it as my personal struggle, which was very much the wrong thing to do, because it eventually came back to bite me, and it did last year. And so I found myself in this awful situation last year of essentially emotionally bereft. And once I got through all that, I realised that there was many others in the same situation, similar situations, veterans young and old, and particularly those returning from Afghanistan. And I wanted to do something so they would learn from my mistakes. And so I've written this book. It describes my experiences, but it talks about the emotional journey that is attached to combat operations and how it can affect individuals and families.
Well, this emotional journey has been going on for something like 20 years or more. Did at any point to dawn on you that perhaps the time had come that you should quit the military altogether?
No, I loved my job. I loved the experience. I admired the soldiers that I worked with, and in later years sailors and airmen as well, as I became more senior. It's a fantastic profession and deeply rewarding, very challenging but extremely rewarding activity. And I wanted to get on. I wanted to continue my career. I wanted to keep working with soldiers and keep serving my country. And that might sound a little bit twee, you know, the idea of patriotic service. It doesn't quite fit with modern societal expectations, but I feel that, and I wanted to keep going. And again, this is not unique to me. This is what a lot of other folks feel. They want to continue their career. They're afraid to speak up because they think it might damage their career. And regrettably, that's probably still true. I'm hoping to change that a little by making people, including the military, understand better that this is just a normal consequence of being in very, very abnormal situations. Mental illness, mental stress is part of surviving bad things, and it's a normal reaction. I'm trying to make that point.
And you think that the story that you're telling in your book will certainly have a serious impact on the people that you have ignored this sort of traumas?
I hope so. I genuinely believe it can be helpful. I can't be in the army anymore. My service, after 38 years of a very, very satisfying and happy career, largely happy career, is over. But I think I can still do something to help those who do serve our country. And more widely as well, those who are involved in other forms of stressful experiences, ambulance officers, those who work in the emergency wards of our hospitals, firefighters, even tow truck drivers who turn up at car accidents. They have pretty awful experiences a lot of the time, and they will likewise be suffering some emotional trauma. I'm deeply hopeful that I can help people understand that this is a normal reaction if they have a bad reaction to these things. It's perfectly normal, and it needs to be treated just as a normal consequence. If you injure yourself in a sporting pursuit, you go and see a doctor to fix your broken shoulder or sore thumb. If you are mentally stressed, go and see someone professional who can help you with that. There's nothing to be ashamed of, and I do hope that message gets out.
Given your bitter experiences, how do you think our SAS soldiers who are on the front line and of course involved in killing and destruction and so on cope with this, with their traumas?
Well, it's not just our SAS soldiers. Of course, they are extraordinary people. It's our other special forces like the commandos and the special forces engineers and others who help them out. But it also applies equally to our infantry battalions and others who have done service so recently. All of those people who are involved in combat will be experiencing some brutal memories, and some of those will be more resilient than others. There's no way of knowing, as I understand it. I'm no mental health professional, but I've learned a few things lately. But there's no way of knowing who's going to be affected. About 1 in 5 are affected by PTSD as a result of combat experience, and of all the total who are exposed, about 1 in 8 will suffer long-term and very detrimental effects. Now, those numbers might sound relatively small, but when you consider how many thousands of servicemen and women have been through our recent military activities, that adds up. And then you add that to the experiences of those who served in Vietnam and those other non-military incidents that I mentioned. All of these things are going to be building and accumulating. There is a cost, a human personal cost, and there'll be a societal cost, because we as a society owe it to these fantastic Australians to do something to make sure that they understand that what they've done is honourable and right, and now, perhaps if they need some help, that's okay as well.
But do your experiences inform you that the horrors of war simply do not necessarily produce the desirable outcomes that we are all looking for?
Regrettably, the human condition still includes this awful inclination to go and kill each other on a regular basis. And I wish it wasn't so, but it is the way it is. And we only need to look at any news headline and can see that everywhere around the world. While that occurs, there will be a need for occasionally military force to be a component of national power. And that's all fine. And that's absolutely the way it is, and one day we'll evolve beyond this, but we're not there yet. But it is a terrible cost.
But it's been going on for a long time, so
it is,
you know, when is that one day is going to come? I mean, it's been for centuries that people have been on each other's throats and have been killing one another, and yet there have been people like yourself who've come out before and said that, look, they're pointing out the futility of war as a means to achieve international or solve international problems.
Yes.
And yet we're still going on with fighting, and
we are. It's very sad. Look, there are times when military force is the only option and where it does produce a good outcome. I'm looking, say, at the East Timor situation in 1999, where military force intervened to produce an outcome that was better for all concerned, and happily with low levels of violence. There are other places, the Middle East particularly, where this is not the case, and there are many other parts of the world. It's just a regrettable part of our human condition. There is no pacifist, though, like someone who's been to war. And so often you hear veterans, particularly those who have separated from the services and have had time to think and reflect. You start to take a different view. While you're in the military, it is absolutely appropriate that you focus on the mission, and it's all about combat and the consequences of that, and enduring that and winning, because that's what we need military people to do. Later, perhaps, can come some reflection, and I certainly abhor the things that I have seen and wish I had never seen many of them, and I so deeply regret the losses that have occurred recently, especially those ones when I was in the privileged position of being our national commander in the Middle East.
I mean, tell me something about your experiences in the Gulf. I mean, you were involved in the first Gulf War and you're involved in the second Gulf War. I mean, one can understand the objectives of the first Gulf War, and that was the liberation of Kuwait, and perhaps that was a positive outcome in a lot of ways. But the second Gulf War, which was in pursuit of overthrowing Saddam Hussein's regime, do you think that we've got the right outcome?
Look, I do agree with you that the first Gulf War was justified in the strictly academic concept of what is a just war, and it was a just war. it produced some horrible killings and vast loss of life, but it was, at the first order of consideration, a just war. The second war that I was involved in Iraq, I think has some dubious justifications, and that was the case then, and many people, I think, would come to the view now that history will judge that intervention as something that would have been better not undertaken. Whether it would have, the situation would have solved itself, who can say? But it would be hard to imagine that a dictatorship such as that which Saddam Hussein operated could have survived indefinitely. So, you know, maybe we didn't need to intervene. In doing so, though, we stimulated a spasm of violence and killing which was just truly horrible. And in 2006, when I was directing strategic operations on behalf of the whole coalition out of Baghdad, at the peak of that violence through that dreadful summer of 2006, 3,000 civilians were being killed every single month in sectarian violence and in high-profile bombings by Al-Qaeda. Coalition soldiers were dying by the dozen. Law and order had broken down, and that experience of war was certainly not one that left a very pleasant taste in my mouth.
In retrospective, would you have advised the Australian government to have a different approach to Second Gulf War?
I wish the whole of the international community had not lost its focus on Afghanistan after our intervention. We defeated the Taliban, but we sort of lost the game.
Did you defeat the Taliban, or you toppled the Taliban?
I think that's a correct description, yes.
And you basically dispersed the leadership of the Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan.
I think that's quite a legitimate summary. Yes, that's the case. And that dispersal inevitably began to then regather and rear its head again. And so we were distracted by that. Perhaps we might have finished the job. Afghanistan now might be a quite different place had we not done that, if the international community had not lost its focus. And my comments about whether the intervention in Iraq then in 2003 was the right thing to do, and I think history will judge that quite poorly. If we had stayed where we initially started, at least in some form, maybe we wouldn't now have the mess that we have.
From some of your public comments, I gathered that you're not terribly optimistic about the future of Afghanistan. How do you see Australia's involvement in the province of Uruzgan? Do you think that by the time Australian forces withdraw from that province, we are going to leave Uruzgan, a relatively peaceful Uruzgan, behind, or it's going to be as turbulent as it has been in the past, and what Australia has really achieved in the last many years with a lot of money and blood would be very minimal?
These are really big questions, aren't they? And these are the ones that I would hope be turned over with great care and deliberation by our political masters. I think that the prospects for a long-term happy outcome in Afghanistan more broadly are quite remote. Our component of the fight is quite narrow. We are in the southern part of Afghanistan, and principally in Uruzgan, as you said. Of course, our special forces and some of our conventional forces range more widely, but not much. Afghanistan, though, as a problem for the international community, I have to say doesn't appear to be on track for a very wonderful outcome in a few years' time. And I can come back to that perhaps. You know, Uruzgan, though, our forces have achieved positive outcomes. It's been achieved not just with military force, but with those DFAT and AusAid representatives that we've sent there, who have tried to bring along the governance and help out with issues such as schooling and health. Certainly security is better in Uruzgan province than it was, and markedly so. The training of the Afghan National Army has progressed well, I know that, and my senior colleagues in defence assure me of this as recently as yesterday in a conversation.
Despite reports about all these so-called green and blue killings and so on?
In spite of that, the shocking results of these rogue elements, if you like, within the forces that we're training, not just Australia, of course it affects many coalition countries who are in Afghanistan, turning their guns on those who are training them is just a terrible thing, because it is so hard to guard against, and yet it is so provocative and so strong an undermining effect. And so it is a very difficult emerging and perhaps growing component of what we're doing there. But all of those things considered, I think a reasonable person would say that things are better in Uruzgan province for Australia's efforts. And that's why I would absolutely deny the assertion from some that interprets my words as saying that the efforts are in vain. They are not in vain. Our soldiers have done things which have made life better for ordinary Afghanistani citizens, and particularly in Uruzgan. But the longer-term prospects for Uruzgan and the longer-term prospects for Afghanistan are much more in question, in my view.
Well, given that the long prospects are very questionable about the country as a whole, do you think there will come a point that Australians will look back and say, what was all that about, and why did we really make those human sacrifices?
I hope that's not the case, but I fear that might be the case. And I also fear that if things don't go well in Afghanistan, and there are so many forces that would make it go badly, that even people in Afghanistan might one day look back and go, was Australia here? What did they do? Who were these people? Because they all perhaps have found themselves in another unhappy place. I mean, look at the challenges confronting the poor old Afghan farmer and his family in Uruzgan and elsewhere. The central government is of dubious legitimacy, of proven incompetence, corrupt up and down, left and right. You've got governance which is weak. The distribution of authority from the central government is very poor. The health system across Afghanistan in the round is poor. The judicial system is almost non-existent and broken. Even the security forces, although they are in much larger numbers and much better trained than they were, will not be a first-rate military force. There won't be a first-rate police force. In fact, perhaps the greatest weakness in Afghan's future lies in its policing, not in its military capacity. So there are so many things wrong. And then add on top of that the international dimensions of Pakistan sitting right next door, other states not too far away who are very, well, not unstable, but of a destabilising influence perhaps. The prospects are poor. And if you were sitting back as this as a purely military problem, you would probably think this was not the course of action you'd want to be heading down. But we are where we are, and I just do hope it turns out better than I fear, but I am not optimistic.
But do you see the Afghanistan case so far as a sort of military failure or political failure? Or actually we haven't done well on either of those fronts?
Look, I think it's been militarily reasonably well prosecuted, although the strategy, the fact that we drifted along with a sort of an ill-formed strategy for a period of time, wasn't helpful. We went in for the right reasons and rapidly toppled the Taliban, but then we've sort of drifted. We've had this mission creep and mission translation into a nation-building role now, and democracy is sort of part of their outcomes, and a functioning bureaucracy and those things. Okay, well, they're very noble outcomes, but military force is not always the best way to achieve those sorts of things. I do think that the diplomacy and the strategy, the broader international strategy, could well be challenged, and ask ourselves whether we've done it the right way, whether the military forces were in the right places for the right period of time, at the right times, and whether some of our decisions that have led to the current structure of the Afghanistan government are the ones that we would have liked to have in place. We're battling uphill here. It was always going to be a very difficult problem to solve the Afghanistan problem. And I honestly don't think it is soluble. I don't think we can solve it. It's not something we can solve it.
So do you think this is really up to the Afghan people
well, obviously,
to get their act together, despite the fact that they are under constant pressures from the neighboring states. And of course, Afghanistan has historically been a highway of conquest in one form or another.
Yes.
And how would that really help the Afghan people to be able to get their act together and rebuild their state and nation without too much international involvement?
Well, the Afghan people have long suffered through poor governance within their own country and by the interference of other states. And I formed a very strong affection for the Afghans who I met in villages and in towns, who by and large just want to get on with their lives. They want to just raise their families and get their goods to market and see their families educated and care about their tribal and family concerns. But they are in a very, as you say, a very volatile part of the world, and it is unfortunately poisoned by a vast drug economy, by corruption, by the proximity of hostile actors, by politics which includes violence as a component of how it does business. I do fear for the lot of the average Afghan citizen, and it's wonderful that we've been able to, even for a little while, improve their lot. They can, in our province, Arizgan, you can get their goods to market. Their women and children can be given slightly better treatment, and health is at least available, if not widely available. There are very good outcomes, and they've been so hard won at the loss of lives, and so it cannot be just dismissed as, oh well, that was nice. The idea of all of this, of course, is to give the Afghans a chance to solve their own problems and to forge their own future, and that future is very very troubled and will be very difficult. And the support of the international community, I think, is essential at this time. But sooner or later, it has to be their problem.
Major General, you have expressed a lot of concern about the loss of soldiers under your command. But one must not really forget that also a lot of civilians have been killed as a result of their operations. It's not just the Taliban, but also, I mean, from the opposition side. What message do you have for the Afghan victims of this war, and that so many of them have been killed? And of course, that was also true in the case of Iraq.
And in every war. This is a terrible consequence of the things that are going on in Afghanistan and in other parts of the world. The regrettable fact is that many of the explosive devices built by the insurgents kill Afghan civilians. In fact, more likely to kill Afghan civilians than military personnel, because at least the military are on guard for these things. They have equipment to search for the explosive devices. They're well protected and well trained. It's a different story for some poor farmer trying to get his corn to market, who steps on one of these things, or whose children run over them in the field while playing. So the consequences to the civilian population of war zones is always terrible. And I saw that so brutally illustrated in Iraq in 2006, where a bombing might kill a number of coalition soldiers and cause terrible, terrible wounds. But the numbers of losses were quite low. Compare that to what happens to a civilian, and it would cut a swathe through.
But could you have really paused at that point and say, this is not something that I really want. I want to get out of it.
Me as a person?
Yes.
Look, as a professional soldier, part of the deal involves confronting horrible scenes and participating in actions which involve death and injury and destruction. As we discussed earlier, warfare is a component of the human condition. Regrettably, it's the way it is. And at times, of course, I was repelled by what I was seeing. I'm a man as well as I'm no longer a soldier, but at the time I was both a human being and a combat soldier and a leader with responsibilities to maintain the morale of my troops and to lead them and to form plans to win. At the end of the day, I and all those other military commanders out there serve their governments and through them the people of their nation, and they have been given a certain job and they are to do it. The day that the military start turning around and going, well, hang on, I'm not going to do what you tell me because I don't like it, is the day that our military relationship between civilian and military, and where the civilians have primacy, is completely unravelled. So I did my job. I did what I was ordered to do. I did it to the best of my abilities, and I did it humanely and carefully and respectfully, and like so many, in fact almost universally amongst the soldiers that I commanded and other servicemen and women, did it in a way which recognises and respects and is very careful with the use of force amongst civilian populations. So I'm proud of how I've served. I'm proud of how the rest of our people serve still. But warfare is an ugly business, and it produces ugly outcomes, and will be ever thus, I fear.
But you're not the first figure, and won't be the last one, to denounce the horrors of war. And we know the late U.S. Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, expressed a lot of regrets about the Vietnam War many years later. And of course, but by then, hundreds and thousands of people had been killed in Vietnam. How do you think that you're going to make a difference by coming out and explaining to the Australian public, and for that matter to the international community, that perhaps war is not really the best way to secure solutions for problems which are essentially very political in the world? And how would you, for example, stop our political military leaders or make them pause to think twice before they commit Australian forces in another conflict next time?
Well, I'm not so vain as to think I really can make a difference in these important areas. I'm just one voice, as you say, and despite being a Major General, retired, you know, that's just one voice. And I don't think I set out to try to change the humanities' view of warfare, or even our own military or government's views of warfare. I do hope that in writing, as I have done, about the human dimension of what we've exposed our soldiers and sailors and airmen to, that I might give them pause for some thought about the human cost. I don't expect, though, that our Prime Minister or Defence Minister or our Chief of Defence Force will weigh up my words when they're making their very difficult and important decisions about the use of military force as a component of national power. What I do hope to achieve is perhaps just stay in that human dimension, talk about the emotional cost, encourage others to do something that I failed to do until recently, and that is to address the problem. So I want to scope the problem down to the individual, to the family, to the team of soldiers who might be mates, and ask them to consider, are they all okay, and to do something if they're not.
I know you've gone through a very terrible time, and particularly since you left the military. But my question is that how is that going to really shape your future now? I mean, do you see a brighter future for yourself, and therefore maintaining your campaign in support of more humanitarian causes, and therefore perhaps in opposition to military involvement?
Look, it may well be that way. I am on a journey of recovery, and it will be a long journey, and indeed I will never forget the things I've experienced, and there will always be in my mind and in my heart the sadness and the frustration and the revulsion of some of the things I've seen. And they won't go away, and it's the same for every veteran. You can't just expunge these things. I do hope to find some way in the future to continue to have a voice that is based on some experience, a voice that can encourage people to look after themselves and their loved ones. I might like the opportunity to do some more writing and do what I can. I've involved already in a number of veterans organisations, helping our wounded veterans and our mentally disturbed soldiers and other servicemen to get better, and I'm hoping to do some more of that. I don't see myself changing the world. I'm just one person. I've had some pretty extraordinary experiences, but they're not unique. But I do hope that perhaps through this one book and maybe some others to follow, that I can do some good, and that's, I guess, all we can hope for.
But by telling your story, do you feel that you have been able to lift a huge responsibility off your shoulders? Not
lifted off my shoulders, no. The writing of this this account was very difficult. It forced me to go back and confront memories that I have deliberately and very assiduously buried and refused to go near for a long time. A very poor approach, I have to stress. That's not how it's solved. But the writing has done me some good, and it's now out there in the open. I've laid myself bare in the writing of this story, at the risk of some ridicule even. But I hope in doing so that those who are struggling along as I did might look at this book and look at me and go, okay, well, if this guy been around a long time, reached general officer rank, if he's prepared to say there's a problem, well, maybe I can speak up as well. So it's done me some good, and I hope it will do some good to others.
I thank you very much, and I wish you all the best for the sale of the book.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Many thanks.
Thank you indeed.
Many thanks.